So building my own bespoke agentic pipeline has completely changed the output of agentic development for me. I was just writing Claude code instances and doing them in parallel, trying to maintain context, trying to control drift. When I figured out that you should actually be creating your own pipelines, it's completely changed output quality and so forth. Today, I want to talk about how you can do this, why you should do this, and exactly why these generic promised factory things that exist all over the internet just really aren't worth the time and energy. Okay, so what is agentic development, right? And why are we talking about this, right? And there's a lot of people who basically say agentic development's the future, right? And my argument to that, and there's a lot of developers who are like, they go, oh my God, it is really useful, but then it also messes up a ton. And so the idea of agentic development is this idea of trying to have an agent do development without necessarily having human in the loop, right? Now, I would argue that you should still always have human in the loop in some component, but agentic development, in theory, from a purist perspective, is this idea that you would have an agent take everything from development and it would go all the way to prod, right? It would do all of its tests and so forth, right? Which to me is not really useful, but I think that you can take the concept of agentic development and pair it with this concept of an agentic pipeline, and you can get right closer. So why is this like a topic, right? It's a topic because everything is about more output with the same high quality, right? So like, how do you use AI to create more output while maintaining the code quality? And there's a bunch of companies on some open source projects that are like throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at this as a problem. They're trying to create what are called AI factories. This idea that like all they need is acceptance criteria or user stories or something, and they can do it. And there are other ones like, oh, it's not Smoketown. It's one of the repos is called Wasteland. I'll think about it at some point. Steve Yeagle is the guy who did it, but there's a bunch of these factory concepts. And I've tried these factories, and I've tried 4 or 5 of them. And the reality of these factories is that none of them have particularly worked well for me. And I stopped one day and I realized, okay, so what are these, right? And why are they happening? And all they are is basically a bunch of wrapped Claude code instances or whatever kind of development instance you want, context and memory and all these other tools. And you're like, okay, why do these exist? They exist because generally speaking, using AI hits context window ceilings, right? Which is getting better for the record because now it's like 1,000,000 tokens instead of 200. The other component is single personality ceilings, right? If an agent is doing something, it's only generally doing that as a personality. Claude, I will argue, by the way, it's entirely possible that by the time you're watching this video, it's completely out of date because Claude is starting to introduce the idea that you can orchestrate multiple personality agents within just Claude. So I'll call that out. Observability is a big one, by the way. Having observability into agentic development, the decisions it made, where get discipline ceilings too, right? So there are inherently ceilings, if we can agree on it, that using a single instance of Claude code will run into. So why don't I like factories? Why I don't like factories is because there's a reason why Ford doesn't build every one of their cars in one factory, right? This idea of that there's an agentic development factory and that it should be able to apply to every code base and every different component that you have is insane to me. And so what I want to pitch for you is this idea of agentic pipelines. And I will show you how it works and kind of why. But agentic pipelines are basically the idea that you take everything that's good about an agentic factory, which is reusable agents, custom prompts, memory, sharing things, but you create bespoke pipelines for specific things designed around your repo. And the beautiful thing about this is they're completely your pipelines. Generally, pipelines across the projects that we're working on all have the shared building blocks. They all have the same building blocks, but like how a pipeline is set up, the review systems, what's parallel, what's not parallel, it all is bespoke to you, right? And okay, what does this actually mean? And I have some diagrams down below, but I'll show you briefly from a code perspective. So this is just an example dev pipeline that I have that I will use sometimes. And what this is simply just a function in this case that when runs a bunch of different instances of Claude code, excuse me, and then based on things it does, it goes through the route. If I give it a task, the first thing it does is it writes a manifest, and then that manifest is saved. And depending on that manifest, there's a bunch of different Claude code instances that spin up that then do research on that manifest. And then those Claude code instances each write development plans, right? And then those Claude code instances are reviewed by a manager. And then there's an orchestrator that spins out all the next Claude code instances to actually do this stuff, right? And you can see that there's steps like replanning and these other components. But the point here is that then it creates this whole pipeline system that does it. Now we've taken it a step further, which is we then went ahead and wrote an app for governance of this pipeline. So when the agentic pipeline, it spits out a manifest. When it's doing the build, you can see all the build steps. When it adds tests, you can see its runtime tests. You can see all of its commits and so forth. Because actually in our pipelines, one of the key components that we did is every time a pipeline runs, it makes a new branch. Every step, it does commits. And we have a ton of visibility into it. And then the component that I want to really highlight to you is that in a lot of our projects, we have upwards of 8 to 10 different pipelines, depending on the task. So when we're writing test automation for something, there's a specific pipeline that pulls the commit. It then looks at the commit and so forth. And I'm going to get into a how-to video in the future, but why is this a thing, right? The core of it comes down to 4 core things, right? And once again, I'm going to caveat all this by saying it's entirely possible that Anthropic has changed all this by the time you watch this video, and a lot of it's out of date. But in this moment, it's super useful. First is chaining different personalities, right? The ability to have managers, the ability to have things that are not influenced by the previous Claude Code instance. So like right now, Claude Code can spin up a bunch of independent agents and do stuff, but like I really do find that having completely independent instances of Claude Code are different personalities. The other thing I'll add to different personalities, the idea of agentic pipelines are not limited to one agentic system, right? So you can use things like OpenAI and Codex as part of this process because all they're doing is it's just creating a bunch of like evidence and documentation repos that basically are then being referenced, right? You would lose things like memory and some of the other built-in components when it's like a single provider, but at the same point, you do benefit a lot by having different models looking at the code. Escape context window sealing. This is a nice one just because basically you have the ability to now not have to deal with compressed summaries and being passed forward and instead passing full transcripts and like documentation for it. And so you're breaking up all of the work and you can actually have planning instances or planning steps of the pipeline, like show that process. Next is owning the whole Git story end to end, right? So in this case, a pipeline owns its own work tree, creates its own branch, keeps it super, super clean. I just like that being built into the process. And then you have observability and governance by design. This is optional, but this is super, super useful. So how is this different though than like Claude skills or Claude commands? The main thing that I would argue that it's different is it's inherently a deterministic system in many ways. So like a pipeline forces a deterministic system. I basically would argue that Claude skills and commands should be married with pipelines. So you should build out an agentic pipeline that is designed around your needs and specific tasks and a bunch of different pipelines for those things. You should have Claude skills to help with those. You should have Claude commands to help with those, but they should just be part of the pipeline, right? Cool. And here, a bunch of specialized roles, right? So feature goal, in this case, here's a pipeline breakdown. So you have a planner role, that then planner role creates, in this case, like a TDD style work. So you have an executor and refactor. So the first executor is going to write tests and it's going to execute it and make sure that it fails. The next is going to write the code and make sure it passes. And then you have a refactor one. Between those, you have the concept of review and verifier. And then ultimately you have managers that either block or promote it, and then it's merged to main. And essentially, like, once again, I will emphasize this can be completely customized to anything you want, right? The whole concept in my mind of an agentic pipeline is the idea that you should own this process yourself and not be like reliant on, oh, you have to do factory work this way. Because like to me, code bases are just too complex to justify it otherwise. Each block gives a fresh context every time. This is important for me. I just find that it's significantly more accurate at scale. I don't really want to go too into detail here, but this kind of lays out the different steps and why it's getting the context every single time. So I will say this pairs really nicely with the policy as code concept. So if you don't listen to many of my policy as code videos, that's a concept I came up with, which is basically this idea of a linter on steroids, but it's like this concept that ultimately code bases are just a series of patterns. And when you have AI, you inherently deal with drift, even when you're dealing with all the rules and the other tools that AI gives you. And so the concept is you should have hundreds and hundreds of essentially rules that are policy as code that control and constrain AI's development. And then when you have an agent, right, the benefit is you can now build in your policy as code as part of your pipeline. So you have a planner agent, you have an executor agent, and like before you even run your tests, you should run your policy as code to make sure that no errors are present, right? Policy as code is all about the quality of the code, and then your tests are much more about like the business outcomes of the code, right? And you have your steps. So Why should you do this? You should do this for two core reasons. One is you can do significantly larger and longer and more complex development this way. So your prompts can be significantly bigger and more wide ranging, and you'll have success. Two is that you ultimately can run a lot more things in parallel too. You have a lot less time dealing with your human brain, trying to manage 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 instances of Claude code at any given time. And instead, if you do planning effectively and you really think about what feature you want to add, what I find is that agentic pipelines are significantly better at like shotting things, or at least getting it much closer. The downsides of this, and it's worth noting, one is that they run significantly longer than Claude code, right? Because you're pairing a bunch of instances of Claude code together, it just takes longer because every single time like one is trying to come up to speed on where the other one's left. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently is kind of try to how to do that. Claude has in the last few weeks released a bunch of tools, I think, around like context and some of these other pieces to make that more effective. It's just not something I've looked into yet. So the core trade-off is time, right? It's if you want a feature done, my argument is to do it right. It should take time, but it's not going to be like the dopamine hit of AI doing something in 2 minutes and then being done. It's going to have a planning phase. It's going to have development. It's going to have managers reviewing that development. It's going to be running your policy as code suite, which can take upwards of 5 minutes at times, right? But in theory, if this works, the output is a branch that is ready to merge at the end that's much closer to what you would have gotten. Yeah, that's my case for why you should be building your own agentic pipelines. I'm going to be doing a couple of videos coming up about like how to actually do them and like how to get started with them, but would love to hear your feedback on whether or not you think this is the right direction, wrong direction. Yeah. And so that's all I got. Check me out on LinkedIn, Ben Fellows on LinkedIn, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. It'd mean a lot. I'm trying to do a lot more content coming up. And if you have any thoughts, feedback, anything that you want, drop in the comments. More than happy to do it. All right. Talk soon. Bye.